You told me once that you knew about temperature of body or DNA, so you knew that once you started a fire, no one ever probably would prove unless you really did break it twice. Right. You for sure. You didn't have to take a weapon in with you. So did you know there would be a weapon in there that you could use? Or did you plan on just strangling her to death? You said you had nothing, no clothes on.
I felt capable of going what I want to do.
At this time we've spoken, and you agreed to speak with me about what has happened. Is that correct?
Yeah.
He'll tell them what he did to his wife if her ex-husband is present in the room. The power and authority that gives Barnes is significant. He is now going to not only get to relive the crime and the violence that he inflicted on his wife, but he's going to get to see the emotional reaction and trauma that it causes on her ex-husband.
Okay. We contact Mr. Birdie. He has agreed to come to the sheriff's office substation and is present here in the room with us now. Mr. Barnes, this is a request that you made, is that correct?
Yes, it is. I released from prison October 31st of this year. I went back to drug use. December 11th. Some coffee, a paper. Found some drugs in the house, some crack cocaine. Must have put it there prior.
He's clearly denying and minimizing and not taking responsibility and doing what a lot of drug abusers do, but also psychopaths do, blame it on something else. It's not me, it's the alcohol. And he's kind of doing the same thing. It's sort of the same script.
He got really upset. In tears. He locked the bedroom door and don't get out of the house. She started hitting me or kneeing me or something. I stepped under, got behind her, and grabbed her around the neck. And we went to the floor hard. Okay. Yeah. She went face first. I held on. I saw blood. I picked her up off her feet. I don't know how she did it. She got a hold of the wall. And it took me out balance.
Barnes is trying to paint this as a simple lover's quarrel or marital disagreement when in fact there's broken doors, there's holes in the walls, there are door frames that have been removed by somebody grabbing them and kicking them in. This is not a situation of two people who had a misunderstanding that spun out of control. The intense displays of emotion that you hear in Barnes and his account are superficial at best. They're insincere, they turn on and off like a faucet of waterworks, and ultimately they're not consistent with how people display real emotions. What they are is highly consistent with how a psychopathic individual views emotions and what they think people want to hear and see. It's not uncommon when we have these types of displays of emotion that if you actually look closely, there's no tears. And we don't have a video of this point in the interview, we have an audio, but he reconstitutes pretty quickly and then immediately turns the emotions back on where he's out of control and can't even get the words out. And emotions just don't work they don't work like an on-off switch, they work like a dimmer switch. And psychopaths have a difficult time understanding that subtle reality because again, they are mimicking what they think people experience, but because they don't experience those emotions and they don't feel them internally, they're guessing.
And you're still in your mind, or on the floor.
Her head first. We went down.
He never owns responsibility for killing her. It's a distanced description. She need him, he thinks. He pushed her down. It was hard. He doesn't know how it really happened, but she went face first. If you think of it like a painting, you're getting a very broad brushstroke of something about the scene, but you can't fill in the detail.
When I left her on the floor, she was squirming, trying to get away. You still trying to hold her? I was holding. I didn't want her to fight me no more. I didn't want her to fight back. I held on until I knew she could fight me anymore. Lynn died. What do you do while you're at home? I thought I could make things okay. I just started cleaning up, doing dishes. What did you do? Stay with it. Did you do anything to hide the fact that you were responsible for that? For what? For her death? No. Let me tell you something. In the recycle bins outside, why did you take the trash in the road? It's not a nice trash bin. Why do you care about the trash when your wife's dead in the house? I figured if I just want to make it look normal. I was trying to act normal, so I stayed there all day.
The fact that Barnes continued to stay in their home for 2 days, knowing there was a dead body in the closet, and he took more care and attention to make sure that the trash was taken out, dishes were cleaned, that the home was otherwise orderly, really shows a disconnect. His feeble attempt at taking the trash out so that things look normal doesn't really compensate or equate to the loss of human life, but in his mind, they're somehow equal. They're equal gestures.
You realize what you did? You understand?
That's it.
Believe it or wrong.
Can't believe it happened. Everything's gone. Everything feels white.
James, is that the extent of what you want to tell Tony?
Take that. I just want you to know you never do anything wrong. I was sick. She loved me very much. When it came to stupid, it was just, wait, hold on. If I had told you what I knew a long time ago, you would have known what to do.
Barnes could be alluding to the fact that he knows more than they know. It's clear that he's saying, if you had known about what I was going to do earlier, maybe you could have done something about it. So it's a way of blaming the ex-husband as well. So he still doesn't have responsibility in his mind for what he did.
Thus concluding the interview, so switch to side B. Interviews concluded.
Barnes would have us believe this was just a domestic dispute, but we know that that's not the case. He had killed before.
Knock, knock. Come in. Oh, it was 5:14.
Well, good for you. You been in confinement?
Yeah. She moved tall.
She went through death rows.
Okay.
That's body description's bad. Couldn't catch his breath or what. They didn't transfer me over here. Pulling this down.
No.
Yeah.
No.
Oh, okay.
He's fine. He's just doing the audio.
No problem. Are we on video right now?
Yes.
I've known you for a little more than 4 months, and I trust you. I'm talking about a matter that happened in Melbourne in 1988. There are no questions you could ever ask me that I would not answer.
This is once again Barnes taking control of a situation. You see his psychopathic side really take the lead. He is narcissistic, he's arrogant, and he really understands that there is a power that he has in this situation because law enforcement wants to understand what this cold case was about.
We talked before about the incident happened in 1988. You never was clear on her name. You said you read it in the newspaper or something.
Yeah, I know. I did to this day, and I swear by Allah, I really don't know. I know I've been told this several times, but I was doing it all the time.
She was Patricia Miller. She was a nurse who lived in a complex near him. It's another reflection of this complete, really, indifference to personal identity. People aren't individuals to a man like Barnes. They're things. And so you can care enough to kill somebody, but they're not really important to remember as individual people.
Sometime in April of 1988, I entered north window of condominium unit. I believe it was River Oaks condominium off Roosevelt Avenue in Florida. I proceeded through the condominium, got a knife out of the kitchen. I caught a that was in South Barbara in her bathroom, and took her in the bedroom. I raped her. I got some shoestrings out of tennis shoes, went back in the bedroom, I tied her up, her hands behind her back. I raped her again. I tied her feet up. I tried to strangle her to death. It didn't happen, and I ended up being death with a hammer back to the head.
There's a lot of sadism. He enjoyed humiliating her. He enjoyed hurting her physically. He enjoyed frightening her. And it was a prolonged several hours before he finally killed her. And he killed in a very personal, frightening way where she was probably experiencing her own death. So intense rage and a deep desire for destruction of the other person.
I went through her condominium. I took a bank card and took out the wallet. I can't remember if I took the wallet around it or not. Put all the items I thought I had touched inside the rucksack. I went outside as I had entered naked. I got on a photo, got a lighter and cigarette, came back in through the front door and set up that on fire. And then I got dressed real quickly and I left. I do believe I locked the front door as I went out. And that's what I did.
Despite the fact that almost 17 years have gone by from when he committed this violent murder, and when he's talking about it during this interview with Insco, he remembers things in a level of detail about taking a bank card, putting things in a rucksack, where he exited the house, whether he left the door locked or unlocked. Barnes has been reliving this crime in his mind, getting a euphoria or a high off of it all these years.
What makes you think about getting naked before you went in there? How did you get the window? You said it was a security system.
Well, I don't know if there was an arm system at the chance, but there was. I had slid my ID to lock a little bit, cash, and just slid right over. The reason why I got dressed before I went in was I didn't want to carry any material into that place. Now, my intent was to kill.
So your intent was the record?
Not my intent was to kill.
The decision that Barnes made to enter the victim's apartment nude suggests that he had a clear intent to sexually assault her. This is a calculated, cold act. This is somebody who doesn't have any attachment to the victim. It was about his own sexual gratification, his own power and control, and his need to kill.
What was on the video that you caught fire to? Was it a sheet of comforter or something?
I believe it was charged before using the same exception. No one wants at the Woodfield Estates. I actually got arrested for first-degree arson, but pretty guilty somehow. Set a bed on fire for the woman. And when I was a kid, next to our neighbor's house, I set that bed on fire.
Barnes starts talking about how he has set fires before. He's set fires when he's a kid. He's burned a bed before. This is consistent with what we know in the psychological research on people with psychopathy, is they've often engaged in other acts of violence before they moved on to torturing humans or killing humans.
You told me once that you knew about temperature, vibe, or DNA, so you knew that once you started a fire, no one ever probably would prove illness, even though you didn't break the laws. Right. You for sure. You didn't have to take a weapon in with you. So did you know there would be a weapon in there to use, or did you plan on just trying one? You said you had nothing, no clothes on.
I felt capable of doing what I wanted to do.
Part of the control dynamic is in planning the hunt, right? Planning the action. They've had a fantasy in their head about how it should proceed and go, the stages that the act will occur in, and they mentally rehearse it.
When did you decide to kill her? I'm not bringing me out the fortune, but you mentioned that she humiliated you before. And, no, that.
You know, I did. I killed her, and I made that decision. But I think it would be very best if I didn't mention our encounter and how I felt when she said it, because I don't want to diminish, anybody. I don't want to put anybody on the best. I did what I did, and I did. Really want to answer that.
This is where we see truly the presentation of a psychopathic personality. He does not owe anyone anything, and as long as he maintains control of the interview, he's good to go. But the minute they start asking him about things that he looks bad or somehow diminish his status and his sense of authority and compromise his ego and his self-esteem, he won't go there. So despite claiming that he would say to Insco, I'll answer anything, he's clearly not willing to.
Why did you decide to kill her?
That's one of those questions.
He doesn't want to talk probably about rejection, about being humiliated. He clearly remembers what she said 17 years ago, and it makes him feel so small and squeamish that he's able to talk about killing her, but he can't talk about how rejection made him feel, because it made him feel like nothing. It made him feel so bad. And because that moment is so difficult for him, so humiliating, he rewrites the story to say that I'm actually protecting her reputation.
And why was it so important for you to try to help me out?
It seemed like that I've been haunted. There's the right way and wrong way to do everything. The right way. You think that I'm not a real person because I hide stuff like this, and I'll do that once in a while. And that's exactly what I do.
This is another example of the control and the appearance of something being perhaps socially appropriate. Barnes is almost saying, I have a spiritual advisor, I'm a spiritual person, think of me in this way, but he's not. We don't see any signs of contriteness or remorse. It still is all about him rather than the victims themselves.
But there's something. You know the saying, I'm all in.
Yes.
I'm all in anyway. And there's a couple of matters that I will resolve with you. But not today. Not today.
What you see is yet again, he's playing games. He's manipulating the situation. He's keeping himself relevant. He's keeping himself in a position of power and control. And he's also keeping himself center stage. He's telling the police without coming right out and saying it, you need me. And when I decide to help you, I will.
Is there anything else that you would like to say about this murder?
No.
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 Sorry or anything?
Mm-hmm.
Onlookers held their noses as police investigators unearthed 2 bodies from shallow graves in a suburban Denver backyard.
I just can't believe it's taken this long, man. Honestly. It's been on 2.5 years. Not since what I'm here for right now, but for everything that's going to come out. I mean, I've been rubbing it in everybody's face. I have so much just told everything. People just choose not to believe stuff like that, you know? It's me. Here I am in all my fury and all my anger. Oh, thank you. I'm gonna give you the world tonight, but I hope you got a little time because there's more than you know. Let me turn it up, man. It's about time. I gotta tell you. I can't stop doing things. And I need this to stop. I either need to die or to be away forever, and I can't be away forever, and I know that once this goes through, they're gonna kill me, so, you know, that's what I gotta do.
They don't know what he's alluding to. So it's an example of the psychological teaser when he's saying, you know, this whole thing could have stopped a long time ago. What is it he's going to reveal? So it's part of that dynamic of being in control of doling out information.
He's basically spreading his peacock feathers, in a sense here, by saying, nothing can stop me. I can't stop myself. The only thing that's going to stop me is if I die, basically, or you lock me up forever.
Why don't you just tell us what happened? It was an accident. We were just sitting there and we were cleaning our guns. Who's we? Jason and myself. You know, Jason is my best friend. I cleaned my cloth. Then we were sitting there, we were talking, and I said, see, you don't want to go off. They're so dangerous and ready to out. And my gun went off. How did it go? I don't, you know, to tell you the truth, 1 minute we're sitting there talking, laughing, and the next minute he's got a hole in his head. And that's my friend right there dead, you know? I understand. Believe me, I do. He was a good guy. I'm so sorry for him and his family. I walked out of the bedroom, I freaked out. I started wiping everything with those gloves. What did you wipe? Everything, doorknobs.
There's nothing that convinces me that this is accidental. He demonstrates no remorse. He's unable to explain how it happened. 1 minute they're sitting there laughing, and the next minute his friend has a hole in his head, as he put it. And rather than call 911 or try to get his friend help if it were an accident, he instead cleans up the mess and seemingly tries to get rid of any evidence that might point the finger at him.
I jumped in his truck, and his ATM was in there, and his credit card was in there.
You got the truck, hit the ATM. How much did you take out of the ATM?
I tried for $250, it wouldn't let me, I took $240.
Then what'd you do?
Started cruising in Colfax, because I was gonna leave, and then I figured I'd get laid first.
So did you pick anybody up?
Yeah, I put 3 girls up there.
too.
After his friend has been shot, he decides to take his friend's truck, uses his ATM card, gets presumably the maximum amount out, and then decides to solicit sex from 3 different women. Because in his words, he thought he would get laid first. So here's somebody who's just lost their best friend and is now instead deciding to take his best friend's card, get money, take his truck, and seek sex. This is definitely not a typical reaction to your best friend being killed.
It's common in speaking with people who suffer from psychopathy. They'll comment on just basic needs. Like, I figured I might get arrested, so I thought I'll go out and have sex first because it might be a long time if I get arrested. It seems very childlike thinking. Like, well, if I'm going to get caught, I might as well eat the cookie I just took out of the cookie jar.
Because I had no intentions of coming in here. I wanted to die. And you can write down, I still want to die. I gotta go praise God, I'm just glad that this is over with. And look, Jason was and I up with Jason. That was a mistake. But I am a killer. I've killed 3 other people. Yeah, well, 4, but one of them, I'm sure they're dead, but I don't know. Who's the 3 other people? Prostitutes.
He makes a distinction between Jason, whom he claimed he didn't intend to kill, and the prostitutes, as he calls his other victims, whom he intended to kill. We found in studies that look at why killers target prostitutes is they feel that they're disposable. And so that feeling comes from sort of contempt, rage, this idea that they're ridding humanity of something unwanted, something dirty, and dehumanizing women in order to justify their ability to kill them.
I still cry about it all the time. I'm not remorseful. Or non-remorseful, jerkery. That's it, man. I'm kind of unique, I guess, in that kind of respects. I picked up this girl at the bus stop. What happened after you picked her up? We drove back and we went into the house. Were you living by yourself then? Nope. I was working. Was she there? Nope. We went downstairs into the basement. Tied her up and strangled her. The only reason I did these things is because I'm sick. Okay. She looked boring. She's real tall, real thin. She has hair down to about here, and she'd just gotten it done. She looked really nice, and she was very pretty. She had perfect teeth. And I notice people's teeth. Do you know this girl? No. Have you seen her on the facts before? No, and that's how I knew I'd get away with it.
She just had her hair done, and she had perfect teeth. It's not the identity of the person that really matters to him. He points out how beautiful they are. So that is, one could say, almost trophy-like. And I would take that as, it's a point of pride for him.
You know what? Because she's dead. There's nothing we can do for her but pray for her. And you know what? She went straight to heaven because we prayed. We prayed before I killed her. We prayed, me and her. I said, we have to pray together because if 2 people come together in God's name, he'll listen. It's this girl in fact. It's me. Here I am in all my fury and all my anger. She was terrified. She knows what's up. I told her I was going to kill her. I told her to not cry. I told her it'll be okay and she'll be in heaven soon and all this will be over and she'll never have to be on the packs anymore. I told her no more bad stuff. Better life. She could leave this one behind anyway.
He talks about basically almost killing these women as an act of benevolence because they're, suffering. He's basically helping them out of their miserable lifestyle. He was doing these women a favor. But in reality, he doesn't know anything at all about these women.
He's learned some Bible verses, and since he's going to kill her, they do that. She goes to heaven. It absolves him of the responsibility. And since he's saving her, maybe he hasn't done a bad thing in his mind. He sees himself as the angel of death.
So how about the second girl? Analethea Maria Gonzalez. Girls are so trusting, it's unbelievable. And I told her, didn't your mother tell you don't get in a car with a stranger? And they tried not to look at me.
White is basically, well, he's shaming her or blaming her. It's her fault. You're supposed to know growing up you don't get in cars with strangers, and she did. So he wasn't able to protect her from himself. It isn't that he had the responsibility to refrain from killing her. In psychopathy, we see that in people like Mr. White, it's somebody else's fault. The environment happened to them. It's not his fault.
Walked in the door and I tackled her that fast. And she got scared. And I told her I wouldn't hurt her as long as everything was okay. She said, I just want to get out of town. Me and my mom have been fighting. So that sucks, you know? Handcuffed her. And I raped her.
She's disclosing her fight with her mom. She's feeling bad about it. He clearly has no emotional reaction to that other than saying, oh, that sucks. And then he handcuffs her and rapes her. These are examples of pure psychopathic, the traits of callousness and lack of remorse and cruelty.
When he expresses those feelings for his victims, it's most likely that he's feigning them. A little empathetic response. He doesn't feel that it's terrible. It's like a narrative commenting on like a tragic story, but that has nothing to do with how he feels about her and anything that would inhibit his violence toward her or killing her.
And I told her that I had to kill her because I couldn't let her go because she knew where I lived. And we had to pray. And we prayed. And we prayed and we prayed and we prayed. And I kept praying for God to show me a different way out, any other way than to kill her. But he didn't tell me. I had to kill her. Strangled her with a belt. What did you do with the girl? Buried her in the backyard. That was number 2. How about number 3? Number 3 was like the sloppiest of all. What's that? I didn't care at that point about getting caught. I wanted to get caught because I knew I wasn't going to be able to stop. And this girl here, number 3, is blind in right eye, bad scar, just tall. I'm thinking 10, 11, perfect. She was staying in the family hotel.
Did you say anything about anything?
Yeah. I'm thinking it was her sister also, but I don't know.
Okay.
She does have children. See, you know, those kids. Where's mom? She doesn't love us anymore. She come home. She come. Birthdays missed. Holidays. Everything.
The reason he targeted prostitutes was less about the fact that they sold sex for money and more because he believed that they were neglectful of their children. Why would White be so angry at women whom he perceives to be poor mothers on whether or not they were? And one possibility is that he had a neglectful and violent childhood.
I got these voices telling me that nobody likes me, that I'm a failure because I hated my mother. I know everybody thinks that it all boils down to that, but it doesn't. Because no matter how good I am to women, I'm very good to them. They always cheat on me.
Is it, and I don't want to put words in your mouth.
No, you're not.
Is it anger? Is it thrill? I've seen it, we've seen it all.
I know, it's not a thrill because you know what? I used to think I had that in my heart. When I went and got that first girl, I thought that this was something I was going to want to do.
Desire?
There was a desire there. I wanted power.
He does allude to a really interesting idea that he's been cheated on. No matter how good he is to women, they cheat on him. He articulates one of the features in people with psychopathy. Mr. White admits it's about power and control over the women that he's killed. There's either a payback or punishment to women for what they've done to him, which by extension means it's really not his fault. He's a victim.
So he describes being cheated on and being angry that no matter how well he treated them, they still cheated on him. And he uses, it seems that anger has just evolved over time. And in order to right that wrong or to gain back his masculinity and to gain back a sense of power and control, he asserts his domination in the ultimate way by raping and killing women later on.
It was a power thing at first, and the second that I had her all tied up, it was fear. I had sex with her, and whatever rage I was feeling, I didn't feel that anymore. Nothing.
Rage toward him. Yeah. Desire between
Lots of desire.
Desire to kill.
Yeah, every day.
What he seems to be describing is intense desire to kill and rage that keeps growing and escalating. It's powerlessness that turns into rage. Rage that's channeled as contempt so that he can then dehumanize the victim. And then the contempt that allows him to play out these sadistic fantasies and enjoy his moments of power side by side with this perverted intimacy. And when he kills, that dissipates the rage. And then it builds up again.
Just like a cat playing with a mouse, it's going to kill it maybe eventually, but it's going to torment it emotionally in that sense. And that would be playing with other people like toys. That would come to the callousness, that ruthlessness that we see in psychopathy, where other people are used for our own pleasure. And that's what Mr. White was doing.
I was doing it because I was evil and I couldn't get the voices out of my head. I lay there at night and listen to them whisper. Whisper and whisper.
So who's telling you this?
Every day God tells me.
So how does he speak to you?
Loud, booming. Every time, you know what it is. It's when the storm's coming. Every time a storm comes in, the lightning starts, or the moon comes in, or there's dark clouds. Like, it triggers me badly. Then I see all these things.
Does it ever stop?
Yeah.
And when does it stop?
Right when their life leaves them.
The thrilling part is seeing life leave their eyes. And with many psychopaths, there's a progression. There's something that seems exciting at the beginning that's not exciting later as they kill more people. It needs more stimulation. To get the same level of excitement from an experience, that level of neuronal feedback that gives them that sense of pleasure.
Merciful, just kill me. Just do it. Be merciful to me. That was quick. Kill me, God. Kill me. Just kill me. I'm not asking much.
He appears to be performing for the camera. He he must know that he's being videoed. And, you know, he comes in and out of being sincere, and this has a performative feel. But there's also, I think, this interesting, grandiose, self-righteous reference to himself where he sees himself as merciful because he doesn't torture his victims, when in fact he does, emotionally does torture them and sexually assaults them.
Onlookers held their noses as police investigators unearthed 2 bodies from shallow graves in a suburban Denver backyard.
Richard Paul White walks out of the courtroom moments after he pleads guilty to 2 counts of murder and 3 counts of sexual assault.
The result of this plea bargain is that Richard White will spend the rest of his life in prison without parole, and there will not be a trial.
Don't matter. After this, I have hell to look forward to, so I'm so excited.
In October 1954, a man named Samuel Doss died in Tulsa, Oklahoma. At first glance, his death could have been mistaken for another family tragedy. Samuel had been seriously ill. In September, he had been hospitalized with symptoms resembling a severe gastrointestinal illness. He received treatment and was eventually discharged. But after returning home, his condition worsened again. On October 12, 1954, Samuel Doss died. His wife, Nanny Doss, was left behind. For a woman who had already experienced more than her share of loss, another death in the family might have seemed tragically familiar. But this time, something was different. Samuel's doctor did not believe that the death was simply the result of natural illness. An autopsy was requested. What the examination revealed changed the meaning of Samuel's death completely. His body contained a very large amount of arsenic. Suddenly, the question was no longer what illness had taken Samuel Doss's life. The question was who had put poison into his body. And that question led investigators toward the woman who had been closest to him. Her name was Nanny Doss. By 1954, Nanny was a middle-aged woman who had lived through several marriages and a long series of family tragedies. She had known the deaths of children, husbands, and relatives. She had also experienced divorce and the collapse of relationships that had once seemed permanent. To the people around her, these events could have appeared unrelated, one person becoming sick, another dying unexpectedly, another passing away after years of personal problems. But once Samuel's body revealed arsenic, investigators began looking backward. The past no longer looked like a collection of separate tragedies. It began to resemble a pattern. Nanny Doss would eventually admit to killing Samuel. But her confession did not end with her 5th husband. As investigators questioned her, the story expanded into decades of deaths within her own family. She was believed to have caused, or later confessed to causing, 11 deaths over approximately 27 years, beginning in the late 1920s and continuing through 1954. The people associated with those deaths included 4 husbands, her mother, a sibling, 2 children, 2 grandchildren, and the mother of one of her husbands. Yet even that extraordinary number requires an important qualification. Nanny Doss was not convicted of 11 murders. She was prosecuted and convicted for only one, the killing of Samuel Doss. That distinction is essential to understanding her story. There is a difference between what a person confesses, what investigators believe happened, and what can ultimately be established in a court of law. Nanny's story begins long before Samuel's death, long before the arsenic found in his body, and long before newspapers gave her the nickname that would follow her through American true crime history, the Giggling Granny. She was born Nancy Hazel on November 4th, 1905, in Alabama. Her childhood was shaped by a strict family environment. Her father, Jim Hazel, exercised tight control over his children and restricted the education and social lives of his daughters. Nanny also experienced a serious head injury during a train journey when she was young, and later she was said to suffer from frequent headaches. These details form part of the known account of her early life, but they should not be turned into an easy explanation for what happened later. A childhood injury, a difficult parent, or recurring headaches cannot by themselves explain a lifetime of violence. What can be established is that Nanny grew up in an environment in which her personal freedom was limited, and that she developed a strong fascination with romance. She liked romantic stories and love columns. She was drawn to the idea of love, marriage, and the ideal partner. That image of romance would remain important throughout her adult life. Around the age of 16, Nanny married Charlie Braggs. It was the beginning of a pattern that would eventually become central to her life: marriage, family loss, and another marriage. Nanny and Charlie had 4 children. But in 1927, 2 of their young daughters died in circumstances believed to involve food poisoning. At the time, the deaths did not lead to a systematic murder investigation. There was no larger theory connecting those deaths to anything else. They were simply 2 terrible losses inside a young family. Charlie, however, eventually became suspicious of Nanny. The marriage broke down, and he left her, taking their surviving daughter with him. Charlie Braggs became the only known husband of Nanny Doss who survived his marriage to her. For Nanny, the end of her first marriage did not mean the end of her search for companionship. Instead, she would enter a series of relationships that, years later, would become part of a far darker story. Her second husband was Frank Harrelson. Their marriage lasted for many years and was described as troubled. Harrelson had problems with alcohol, and the relationship became increasingly unstable. In 1945, after approximately 16 years of marriage, Frank Harrelson died. At the time, Nanny was not arrested. The significance of his death would only become clear years later, when Nanny admitted that she had poisoned him. The death of an adult husband represented a new stage in the pattern later attributed to Nanny. But even then, there was no investigation connecting Frank Harrelson's death to the earlier deaths in Nanny's family. There was no single case file in which all the names were placed together. There was no established chain connecting the children who had died in 1927 with the husband who died in 1945. Each death remained separated by time, circumstance, and family history. Nanny continued living her life. She married again. Her third husband was Arlie Lanning. Lanning was described as an alcoholic and as a man who had extramarital relationships. Their marriage was troubled, and in 1950, Lanning died. Once again, the death did not immediately result in Nanny's arrest. But later, during the investigation that began with Samuel Doss, Nanny admitted that she had killed Lanning. According to her confession, rat poison had been involved. There was also a disturbing connection between Lanning's death and a fire that occurred afterward, when his mother was still in the house. These details would later contribute to the broader picture investigators assembled. But at the time, they did not produce the kind of investigation that would uncover a decades-long pattern. Then came 1953. Nanny's mother, Louisa Hazel, moved in with her. Not long afterward, Louisa died. Nanny later admitted that she had poisoned her mother. The deaths were no longer limited to husbands. The alleged victims now extended into Nanny's immediate family. That same year, Nanny married Richard Morton. The marriage lasted only about 3 months. Morton died in 1953 and Nanny later confessed that she had poisoned him, describing arsenic being placed in his coffee. Yet even this death did not immediately expose the larger pattern. A woman who had experienced multiple marriages could be surrounded by multiple deaths without those deaths necessarily being connected in the eyes of the people around her. Then Nanny met Samuel Doss. Samuel was a Nazarene minister in Tulsa, Oklahoma. He married Nanny in 1953. Unlike some of the men in Nanny's earlier relationships, Samuel was not described as an alcoholic. He was conservative in his outlook and disliked Nanny's romantic novels. The marriage soon became tense. Their differences were not merely about books or personal preferences. They represented two different ideas of the life Nanny wanted and the life Samuel expected. But none of this, by itself, explains what happened next. In September 1954, Samuel became seriously ill and was hospitalized. He was treated and discharged. Then his condition deteriorated again. On October 12th, he died. Nanny had reached the point she had reached after so many previous deaths. Another husband was gone. But this time, the doctor refused to let the death pass without further examination. The autopsy found a large amount of arsenic in Samuel's body. That single medical discovery transformed the case. Samuel's death was no longer simply another tragedy. It was suspected poisoning, and the woman closest to him was now under scrutiny. The investigation was about to move backward through Nanny's life, one death at a time. What began with a single body in Tulsa would soon reveal a history spanning decades. The most important question was no longer how Samuel Doss had died. It was what else had happened before him. And when investigators began asking that question, Nanny Doss started telling them about the dead. Long before investigators in Tulsa began looking backward through the life of Nanny Doss, before an autopsy would reveal arsenic in the body of her final husband, Nanny had already spent decades moving through a succession of relationships, family losses, and new beginnings. To understand the pattern that eventually emerged, it is necessary to return to the beginning, to Alabama in the early years of the 20th century, when Nanny was still Nancy Hazel, a young girl growing up in a household where control was a defining part of family life. Nanny Doss was born on November 4, 1905. Her father, Jim Hazel, was described as a strict man who exercised considerable control over his children. The daughters in particular had limited opportunities for education and social life. Their world was closely supervised, and the freedom that might have allowed them to develop an independent life was restricted. Nanny grew up within those limitations. As a child, she also experienced a serious head injury during a train journey. In later accounts of her life, she was said to have suffered frequent headaches afterward. These facts would become part of the biography reconstructed after her arrest. But they must remain what they are, details of her childhood, not a simple explanation for the crimes that would later be associated with her name. There is no single event in a person's childhood that can adequately explain decades of deliberate violence. What can be said with greater certainty is that Nanny's early life contained strict family control, and that, as she grew older, she developed a strong interest in romance. She read romantic stories and love columns, and the idea of love occupied an important place in the world she imagined for herself. She was drawn to the possibility of marriage, companionship, and an ideal partner. The contrast between the romantic life she imagined and the difficult relationships she would actually experience would become one of the recurring elements of her adult story. Around the age of 16, Nanny married Charlie Braggs. She was still very young, and the marriage placed her quickly into adult responsibilities. Nanny and Charlie had 4 children. From the outside, this was the beginning of an ordinary family life, a young couple, children, a household, and the responsibilities that came with them. But in 1927, that family life was marked by tragedy. 2 of their young daughters died under circumstances believed to involve food poisoning. The deaths were devastating, but they did not lead to a systematic murder investigation. There was no larger investigation connecting them to a deliberate pattern, and there was no reason at the time for authorities to look backward toward future events that had not yet occurred. The two children were simply gone, and the family continued. Yet Charlie Braggs eventually became suspicious of his wife. The exact meaning of those suspicions would become clearer only years later, after Nanny had been questioned about a much larger series of deaths. At the time, however, Charlie's suspicions led not to a criminal case, but to the collapse of the marriage. He left Nanny and took their surviving daughter with him. Charlie would become an important exception in Nanny's history. He was the only known husband of hers who survived the marriage. The two daughters who died in 1927 did not. Their deaths remained in the past, separated from the later deaths by years and by circumstances that did not appear to form a single pattern. After Charlie left, Nanny continued her search for companionship. The romantic ideal that had occupied her imagination did not disappear with the failure of her first marriage. Instead, she would marry again. Her second husband was Frank Harrelson. Their relationship lasted for approximately 16 years, but it was not described as a peaceful marriage. Harrelson had problems with alcohol, and the household was troubled. For years, the marriage continued despite those difficulties. Then, in 1945, Frank Harrelson died. By this point, almost 2 decades had passed since the deaths of Nanny's two daughters. There was no immediate connection between those events. Frank's death stood on its own. Nanny was not arrested. There was no broader case that brought the deaths together. Life moved on. Years later, however, when investigators were questioning Nanny about Samuel Doss, she admitted that she had poisoned Frank Harrelson. That later confession transformed the meaning of his death. What had once appeared to be an isolated tragedy became one of the deaths attributed to Nanny. But the confession would come only after another death had forced authorities to look more closely. In the years between Frank's death and Samuel's, Nanny married again. Her third husband was Arlie Lanning. Lanning was described as an alcoholic and as a man who had extramarital relationships. His marriage to Nanny was troubled, and in 1950 he died. Once again, the death did not immediately produce the investigation that would eventually surround Nanny. There was no single thread connecting the two dead husbands with the two children who had died decades earlier. Each tragedy existed within its own setting. Yet, years later, Nanny would tell investigators that she had killed Lanning. According to her confession, rat poison had been used. There was also a disturbing circumstance involving a fire after Lanning's death, when his mother was still in the house. These details became part of the broader history reconstructed after Nanny's arrest, but they did not, at the time, lead to a criminal prosecution of Nanny. Again, the story seemed to move forward rather than backward. The dead remained in the past, while Nanny remained alive and continued her life. By 1953, another member of her family would become part of that history. Nanny's mother, Louisa Hazel, moved in with her. Not long afterward, Louisa died. Later, Nanny admitted that she had poisoned her mother. This death is particularly significant because it showed that the alleged pattern was not limited to husbands. Nanny's own mother had become one of the people whose deaths were later connected to her. The family circle was becoming the center of the story. Around the same period, Nanny married Richard Morton. This marriage was remarkably brief. It lasted only about 3 months before Morton died in 1953. Later, Nanny confessed that she had poisoned him, describing arsenic placed in his coffee. Once again, the death did not immediately expose the larger pattern. There was no investigation that brought together the deaths of Frank Harrelson, Arlie Lanning, Louisa Hazel, Richard Morton, and the 2 children who had died in 1927. The years between those deaths were too long, and their individual circumstances appeared too separate. There was no obvious reason for authorities at the time to treat them as parts of one case. That is one of the most unsettling elements of the story. The deaths were not presented to the world as a single sequence. They were separated by years, relationships, places, and explanations. It was only later, after the discovery of poison in Samuel Doss's body, that investigators could begin looking backward and asking whether those events had ever been separate at all. Nanny's life was becoming a chronology of relationships ending in death. But the pattern was invisible until someone had a reason to search for it. Then came another marriage. Nanny married Samuel Doss in 1953. Samuel was a Nazarene minister in Tulsa, Oklahoma. He was different from some of the men who had come before him. He was not described as an alcoholic, and his outlook was conservative. He also disliked Nanny's romantic novels. For Nanny, whose interest in romantic stories and love columns had been present since earlier in life, this became another source of tension inside the marriage. The relationship soon became difficult, but nothing about the conflict alone could have revealed what would happen next. At this point, the story had already accumulated years of deaths. But the most important death had not yet occurred. Samuel was still alive. The police had not yet begun asking questions. There was no known investigation into Nanny's past. The woman who had survived one marriage, lost 2 children, lost several husbands, and lost her mother remained outside the center of any murder investigation. That changed in September 1954, when Samuel Doss became seriously ill. He was taken to a hospital with symptoms resembling a severe gastrointestinal illness. He received treatment and was eventually discharged. For a short time, it appeared that he had survived the crisis. But after returning home, his condition deteriorated again. On October 12, 1954, Samuel Doss died. His death could have become another entry in the long history of family tragedy surrounding Nanny. Another husband was gone. Another marriage had ended. Another death might have passed into the background of an apparently unfortunate life. But this time, a doctor questioned what he was seeing. The death did not look natural enough to leave unexplained. An autopsy was requested. The examination revealed a large amount of arsenic in Samuel's body. For the first time, the past and present of Nanny Doss began moving toward the same point. Samuel's death was no longer simply a tragedy. It was suspected poisoning, and the woman who had stood closest to him was now at the center of the investigation. The years of apparently separate deaths were about to be reconsidered. The children from 1927, the husband who died in 1945, the husband who died in 1950, Nanny's mother, Richard Morton, and now Samuel Doss could no longer be viewed only as isolated chapters in one woman's difficult life. The question was becoming unavoidable. Had all of these deaths been connected to the same person? The answer would begin to emerge when investigators questioned Nanny about the arsenic found in Samuel's body. And what she told them would transform the case from the investigation of one suspicious death into the story of a family surrounded by death for more than 2 decades. When investigators began looking into the death of Samuel Doss in October 1954, they were not initially examining a woman known publicly as a serial killer. They were investigating a husband who had become seriously ill, been hospitalized, returned home, and then died. The discovery of arsenic in his body transformed that investigation. But the larger pattern would only become visible when investigators began looking into Nanny Doss's past. What they found, or what Nanny later admitted, stretched back more than 2 decades. The story did not begin with Samuel. It began with the family Nanny had built long before anyone suspected that death might follow her. From one household to another. Her first husband, Charlie Braggs, was the exception in a history dominated by death. He was the only known husband who survived his marriage to Nanny. The two married when Nanny was still very young, around 16, and together they had 4 children. In 1927, however, 2 of their young daughters died under circumstances believed to involve food poisoning. The deaths were devastating, but they did not trigger a systematic murder investigation. There was no established reason at the time to view them as part of a deliberate pattern. They were 2 children who had died inside a family, and the explanation available to those around them appeared to be illness or poisoning through food rather than a carefully planned act by their mother. Years later, after Nanny's arrest, the deaths would be included among the tragedies associated with her name. But it is important to distinguish what was later attributed to her from what was proven in court. The two children's deaths became part of the larger story through the later investigation and Nanny's history. But they did not result in a murder conviction. Charlie Braggs, meanwhile, became increasingly suspicious of his wife. Whatever the precise nature of those suspicions, they contributed to the collapse of the marriage. Eventually, Charlie left Nanny and took their surviving daughter with him. That decision separated him from the woman who would later be linked to numerous deaths, and it also made him unique among her known husbands. Charlie lived. His daughters did not. After the divorce, Nanny continued searching for companionship and eventually married again. Her second husband was Frank Harrelson. Their marriage lasted approximately 16 years. On paper, the length of the relationship might suggest stability, but the marriage itself was described as troubled. Harrelson had problems with alcohol, and the relationship became increasingly difficult. Yet the two remained together for many years. Then, in 1945, Frank Harrelson died. At the time, his death did not result in Nanny's arrest. There was no investigation connecting him to the deaths of Nanny's children, and there was no larger case connecting him to anything that had happened before. His death remained an isolated event. Only later, after the death of Samuel Doss, would Nanny admit that she had poisoned Frank. That confession changed the historical significance of the 1945 death. It was no longer simply the death of a troubled man's husband. It became, according to Nanny's own later account, another killing in a series that stretched back years. But the investigators in 1945 did not have the benefit of the knowledge they would possess in 1954. They did not know what Nanny would eventually say. They did not know how many deaths would later be connected to her. And without that information, there was no established pattern. After Frank Harrelson's death, Nanny married again. Her third husband was Arlie Lanning. Lanning was described as an alcoholic and as a man who had extramarital relationships. The marriage was troubled, and in 1950 Lanning died. Once again, the death did not immediately bring Nanny under suspicion for murder. Another husband was dead, but another husband dying did not automatically mean that his wife had killed him. There were circumstances in Lanning's life that could provide an apparent explanation for a premature death, particularly his problems with alcohol. Yet later, when investigators questioned Nanny after Samuel's death, she admitted that she had killed Lanning. According to her confession, rat poison was involved. That admission added another name to the growing list. It also introduced another troubling circumstance surrounding the Lanning household. After Lanning's death, there was a fire, and his mother was still in the house. The details became part of the broader account of Nanny's history, although they did not produce a criminal case against her at the time. For years, the death of Arlie Lanning remained separate from the death of Frank Harrelson, just as Frank's death had remained separate from the deaths of Nanny's children. The pattern existed only in retrospect. It was a pattern that no one had yet drawn on a single page. The years continued to pass. In 1953, another member of Nanny's family became part of the chain of deaths later associated with her. Her mother, Louisa Hazel, moved in with Nanny. Not long afterward, Louisa died. Nanny later admitted that she had poisoned her mother. This was a significant development in understanding the scope of the alleged killings. Nanny's victims, as later reconstructed, were not limited to husbands who had become difficult or marriages that had deteriorated. The alleged pattern extended into her own family. Her mother was among the people who died around her. That same year, Nanny entered another marriage, this time with Richard Morton. The relationship was brief. Morton died approximately 3 months after the marriage in 1953. Later, Nanny confessed that she had poisoned him and described arsenic being placed in his coffee. Again, there was no immediate arrest. There was no unified investigation into the sequence of deaths. Instead, There was another death in a life already marked by them. A woman who had lost children, husbands, and a mother could still appear to be someone experiencing extraordinary misfortune. That is one of the central difficulties in reconstructing the case. The events did not announce themselves as a serial killing pattern while they were happening. They were separated by years. The people involved were relatives and spouses rather than strangers. Many of the deaths occurred in contexts where illness, age, alcoholism, or other circumstances could make a death appear less suspicious. The significance of each death changed only after another death forced investigators to ask questions. That final turning point came with Samuel Doss. Nanny married Samuel in 1953. He was a Nazarene minister in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and his personality differed from some of the men in Nanny's earlier relationships. He was not described as an alcoholic. He had conservative views and disliked Nanny's romantic novels. The marriage soon became tense. Nanny's long fascination with romantic stories had been part of her life since youth, while Samuel's conservative outlook created conflict with the interests she valued. But tension within a marriage is not proof of murder. The significance of Samuel's relationship with Nanny would become clear only after his death. In September 1954, Samuel became seriously ill and was hospitalized. He received treatment and was eventually released, but his health deteriorated again. On October 12, 1954, Samuel died. This time, however, the circumstances did not end with a death certificate. A doctor questioned whether Samuel had died naturally and requested an autopsy. The examination found a large amount of arsenic in his body. The discovery was decisive. For the first time, there was a concrete medical finding that suggested Samuel had been deliberately poisoned. Investigators now had a suspicious death, a suspected method, and a person close enough to the victim to warrant scrutiny. Nanny Doss was no longer simply a widow surrounded by an unfortunate history. She was a woman connected to a death that appeared to have been caused by poison. And when investigators began questioning her, they did something that had not been done after the earlier deaths. They began looking backward. Frank Harrelson was no longer simply a husband who had died in 1945. Arlie Lanning was no longer simply another alcoholic husband who had died in 1950. Louisa Hazel was no longer simply an elderly mother who had died after moving into her daughter's home. Richard Morton was no longer simply a husband who had died after a brief marriage. The deaths of Nanny's children could no longer be considered entirely separate from the history that followed. One by one, the names began to form a disturbing sequence. But at this stage, the investigation still depended on what Nanny herself would say. The arsenic in Samuel's body could establish that something was wrong with his death. But it could not, by itself, explain the other deaths that had occurred decades earlier. That part of the story would emerge during questioning. And as investigators asked Nanny about Samuel, they were about to discover that the woman standing before them had a story that went far beyond one dead husband. The case that had begun with an autopsy was about to become a reconstruction of nearly 27 years of family tragedy. By the time investigators began reconstructing Nanny Doss's past, the story had already moved far beyond the death of one husband. Samuel Doss had died in Tulsa in October 1954, and the discovery of a large amount of arsenic in his body had transformed what might otherwise have been another family tragedy into a suspected murder. But Samuel was not the only person whose death would now demand attention. As investigators looked backward, they encountered a succession of people who had been close to Nanny, husbands, children, relatives, and members of her extended family. Some had died years earlier. Some deaths had initially appeared to have ordinary explanations. Others had never been investigated as possible murders. The significance of those deaths changed only after Nanny's final husband became the subject of a poisoning investigation. One of the most disturbing names in that history was Louisa Hazel, Nanny's own mother. In 1953, Louisa moved into Nanny's home. It was a seemingly ordinary family arrangement, a mother living with her daughter later in life. But not long afterward, Louisa died. At the time, there was no investigation that connected her death to the deaths of Nanny's husbands or children. Only later, after Nanny was questioned about Samuel, did she admit that she had poisoned her mother. That admission changed the boundaries of the story. Until then, the deaths could be viewed largely through the context of marriage and troubled relationships. But Louisa was not a husband. She was Nanny's mother. Her death demonstrated that, according to Nanny's own later account, the people who could become victims were not limited to the men she married. The family itself had become part of the pattern. The timing was also significant. Louisa died in 1953, the same year in which Nanny's marital life entered another short and ultimately fatal chapter. After the death of Arlie Lanning, Nanny married Richard Morton. The marriage was brief, lasting only about 3 months. Then Morton died. Once again, there was no immediate arrest, no major investigation linking his death to the others, and no public realization that another husband had died after entering Nanny's life. Later, however, Nanny confessed that she had poisoned Morton. According to the account she gave investigators, arsenic had been placed in his coffee. The detail is important because arsenic would later become central to the investigation into Samuel Doss. But in 1953, the death of Richard Morton did not expose the larger pattern. The significance of that fact is difficult to overstate. When viewed separately, the deaths appeared disconnected. When viewed together after the 1954 investigation, they created a sequence that was increasingly difficult to dismiss as coincidence. But hindsight can make a pattern appear clearer than it was at the time. Investigators in the earlier years did not possess Nanny's later confession. They did not have the complete history. They did not have a reason to place every death in the same category. The deaths occurred over many years and involved different people, different circumstances, and different stages of Nanny's life. The absence of a unified investigation allowed each event to remain isolated. Richard Morton's death was followed by another marriage. In 1953, Nanny married Samuel Doss, a Nazarene minister in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Samuel was different from some of the men who had come before him. He was not described as an alcoholic, and his conservative outlook shaped the relationship. He also disliked Nanny's romantic novels, an interest that had remained a notable part of her life since childhood. Nanny had spent years reading romantic stories and love columns and imagining the kind of love and marriage she believed she wanted. Samuel's attitude toward those interests created tension between them. Their marriage soon became difficult. Yet marital tension alone does not establish criminal intent. This distinction matters because the later story can easily make every disagreement appear like evidence of what was to come. At the time, Samuel was simply a husband in a strained marriage. There was no public indication that his life was in danger. There was no known investigation into the deaths of Nanny's previous husbands. There was no reason for the people around him to assume that his marriage placed him inside a deadly pattern. Then, in September 1954, Samuel became seriously ill. He was hospitalized with symptoms resembling a severe gastrointestinal illness. He received medical treatment and was eventually discharged. His return home might have suggested that the worst had passed. But his condition deteriorated again. Within days, the situation became critical. On October 12, 1954, Samuel Doss died. Once again, Nanny was a widow. But unlike the earlier deaths, Samuel's death did not simply disappear into the background. His doctor was not convinced that the death had occurred naturally. An autopsy was requested, and the result was decisive. Samuel's body contained a very large amount of arsenic. The discovery changed everything. The investigation now had a specific substance connected to Samuel's death. It was no longer enough to say that he had become sick and died. The medical evidence indicated poisoning. The person closest to Samuel was his wife, Nanny Doss. Police attention turned toward her, and the years behind her suddenly became relevant. The investigators were no longer looking at a single isolated death. They were looking at a woman whose life contained a remarkable number of deaths among people close to her. The first question was Samuel, but the next question was inevitable. Had this happened before? That question brought the earlier husbands back into the investigation. Frank Harrelson had died in 1945 after a troubled marriage. Nanny would later admit that she had poisoned him. Arlie Lanning had died in 1950, and Nanny would later say that she had killed him using rat poison. Richard Morton had died in 1953 after only a few months of marriage, and Nanny would later confess to poisoning him with arsenic in coffee. Louisa Hazel had died after moving in with Nanny, and Nanny later admitted poisoning her as well. The earlier deaths of two of Nanny's daughters in 1927 were also part of the history that investigators would examine. Their deaths had been understood as cases of suspected food poisoning rather than established murders. And there were additional family members whom Nanny would later associate with her actions, including a sibling, 2 grandchildren, and the mother of Arlie Lanning. The emerging total was 11 deaths. Yet even as investigators uncovered this disturbing history, the evidence did not have the same strength for every death. Some were based primarily on Nanny's own statements made years after the events. Some deaths had occurred so long before the 1954 investigation that the physical evidence available to investigators was limited or non-existent. This meant that the story they were reconstructing was not a simple collection of solved murders. It was a mixture of medical findings, historical circumstances, and Nanny's later confessions. That distinction would eventually become crucial in court. The strongest case was the one that had brought investigators to Nanny in the first place. Samuel Doss. His body had been examined. Arsenic had been found in large quantities, and Nanny herself would ultimately admit responsibility for his death. The other cases presented a different problem. Even if Nanny's statements were accepted as truthful, proving those deaths to the legal standard required for conviction was another matter. The investigators therefore faced 2 separate questions. The first was historical. How many people had Nanny actually killed? The second was legal. Which death could be proven beyond the necessary standard in court? Those questions did not necessarily have the same answer. As the interrogation continued, Nanny began revealing more about the deaths surrounding her life. The woman who had appeared to survive repeated family tragedies was now describing those tragedies from a completely different perspective. The deaths of husbands and relatives were no longer merely events that had happened to her. According to her own admissions, some of them were events she had caused. That revelation made the case extraordinary, but it also created a challenge for investigators. They had to separate confession from corroboration and suspicion from proof. The arsenic in Samuel's body gave them a concrete starting point. The rest of Nanny's history required them to look backward through years of marriages, family relationships, and unexplained deaths. The result was a disturbing picture of a woman whose life had been surrounded by death for decades. Yet the full meaning of that picture would only become clear when Nanny began telling investigators what she said had happened. Her words would provide the bridge between the suspicious death in Tulsa and the long list of people who had disappeared from her life. And once she began talking, the investigation would no longer be about Samuel Doss alone. It would become an attempt to understand how many deaths had been hidden inside one family's history, and how long it had taken before anyone finally asked whether they belonged to the same story. By the autumn of 1954, Nanny Doss had already lived through decades of marriages, family losses, and deaths that would later become part of one of the most disturbing criminal histories in American true crime. But none of those earlier events had produced the investigation that would finally bring her under the scrutiny of law enforcement. The turning point came with her 5th husband, Samuel Doss. His death was different from the others because, for the first time, a doctor refused to accept the explanation of natural illness. That decision created the first clear medical evidence that would connect Nanny to a deliberate killing, and it opened the door to everything that came before. Samuel Doss was a Nazarene minister in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Nanny married him in 1953 after the death of her previous husband, Richard Morton. Samuel was not described as an alcoholic, and his personality and expectations differed from some of the men Nanny had married before. He held conservative views, and he disliked Nanny's romantic novels. That detail mattered because romantic literature and love stories had been a long-standing interest in Nanny's life. From an early age, she had been fascinated by the idea of romance, marriage, and the ideal partner. Samuel's dislike of those books created another source of tension inside a marriage that would not last long. The relationship soon became difficult, but tension inside a marriage is not evidence of murder. That distinction is important when looking back at the events from the perspective of what investigators later discovered. Before Samuel became ill, there was no established criminal case against Nanny. The earlier deaths connected to her life had not been assembled into a single pattern. Her previous husbands had died at different times, and her mother had also died. The deaths of her children belonged to an even earlier period. None of these events had resulted in a prosecution of Nanny. Samuel therefore entered the story not as the latest victim of a known killer, but as a husband whose wife had already experienced an extraordinary amount of personal loss. In September 1954, Samuel became seriously ill. His symptoms resembled those of a severe gastrointestinal illness. He was hospitalized and received treatment. Eventually, he was discharged from the hospital and returned home. At that point, there was no public indication that his illness was the result of deliberate poisoning. From the available account, his condition could still be understood as a medical problem. But his recovery did not last. After returning home, Samuel became ill again. His condition deteriorated, and the illness ultimately proved fatal. On October 12, 1954, Samuel Doss died. For Nanny, this meant another husband had died during one of her marriages. But for the doctor who had treated Samuel, something about the death did not fit comfortably with a natural explanation. That hesitation became the decisive moment in the case. Instead of simply accepting the death as the result of illness, the doctor requested an autopsy. The examination revealed a large amount of arsenic in Samuel's body. The discovery fundamentally changed the investigation. Arsenic was not merely another medical finding. It suggested poisoning. Samuel's death could no longer be treated as an unexplained illness or an unfortunate medical event. There was now a strong indication that a poisonous substance had entered his body. And because Samuel had died while married to Nanny, investigators naturally began examining the circumstances surrounding his final days and the person who had been closest to him. Nanny Doss became the focus of suspicion. The importance of the autopsy went beyond Samuel himself. Before that examination, the earlier deaths in Nanny's life could remain separated from one another. After the discovery of arsenic, investigators had a reason to ask whether other deaths connected to Nanny might also deserve closer attention. Frank Harrelson had died in 1945. Arlie Lanning had died in 1950. Richard Morton had died in 1953. Nanny's mother, Louisa Hazel, had died after moving into her home. 2 of her children had died decades earlier. There were also other relatives whose deaths would later be included in the story. None of these deaths had initially produced a single unified investigation. But Samuel's death provided the first concrete reason to look for a connection. Investigators began questioning Nanny about what had happened to her husband. Eventually, she confessed to poisoning Samuel. That admission was critical because it connected the medical evidence to Nanny's own account of the death. The case now contained 2 powerful elements: the physical finding of arsenic in Samuel's body and Nanny's confession that she had poisoned him. But the interrogation did not stop with Samuel. As investigators continued questioning her, Nanny began speaking about other deaths. Her answers opened a much larger story, one that stretched back approximately 27 years. She admitted responsibility for the deaths of several people in her family. Among those she later identified were Frank Harrelson, Arlie Lanning, Richard Morton, and her mother, Louisa Hazel. The earlier deaths of 2 children were also included among the deaths attributed to her, as were the deaths of a sibling, 2 grandchildren, and the mother of Arlie Lanning. The total associated with Nanny became 11. But the investigation now had to confront a difficult question. What exactly could be proven? Samuel's case was comparatively clear. His body had been examined soon after death. A large quantity of arsenic had been discovered. Nanny confessed to poisoning him. The earlier deaths were different. Some had occurred years or even decades before the investigation. Physical evidence was not necessarily available. Medical records and other documentation from the time were not described as sufficient to establish every death as murder. Much of the connection depended on Nanny's statements. This meant investigators were dealing with 2 levels of certainty. There was the historical narrative created by Nanny's confessions, and there was the narrower legal case that could be presented in court. That distinction would eventually determine the outcome of the prosecution. During the investigation, Nanny's manner also attracted attention. She reportedly laughed or giggled at times while discussing the killings. This behavior contributed to the newspaper nickname that would later define her public image, the Giggling Granny. She would also become associated with descriptions such as Lonely Hearts Killer and Black Widow. These labels reflected the public fascination with the contrast between Nanny's appearance and the deaths surrounding her. Yet the most important reality was not the nickname. It was the victims. They were not strangers selected at random. They were people who had occupied intimate places in Nanny's life: husbands, children, a mother, and other relatives. The case was frightening precisely because the alleged violence occurred within relationships where trust should have existed. The investigation also raised questions about motive. Some of the deaths were associated with insurance money, making financial benefit one possible factor in the broader pattern. But the story could not be reduced to money alone. Nanny's lifelong fascination with romance and marriage was another important part of the account. She had imagined an idealized form of love. Yet several of the marriages she entered became troubled. Some husbands had problems with alcohol. Some relationships were marked by conflict. Samuel, in particular, disliked the romantic novel she enjoyed. These circumstances may help describe the relationships, but they do not provide a complete explanation for murder. The available account does not establish one simple motive that explains every death. What investigators could establish most clearly was the sequence. Samuel became sick, was hospitalized, returned home, became ill again, and died. His doctor questioned the circumstances. An autopsy revealed arsenic. Nanny became the focus of the investigation. She confessed to poisoning him. Then, during questioning, she began describing other deaths. The investigation had crossed a threshold. What had started as a single suspicious death had become a historical reconstruction of a family, surrounded by unexplained loss. Yet even as the number of alleged victims grew, the legal case remained centered on Samuel. Prosecutors did not need to prove 11 murders to establish what had happened to one man in Tulsa. They needed a case that could survive in court. Samuel's death offered the clearest combination of medical evidence and confession. The other deaths might remain part of the larger historical record, but they were not automatically prosecutable simply because Nanny had described them. This distinction would become central to the next stage of the case. The investigation had uncovered an extraordinary number of deaths, but the courtroom would eventually be asked to decide something much narrower: whether Nanny Doss was responsible for the death of Samuel Doss. By then, however, the image of Nanny as an ordinary widow had already disappeared. The autopsy had opened a door, and behind it investigators had found a history that reached back to the late 1920s. The woman at the center of that history had finally admitted to poisoning her husband. The question now was what would happen when the investigation ended and the case moved into the legal system. The distinction between 11 alleged victims and one provable murder would become impossible to ignore. The discovery of arsenic in Samuel Doss's body had given investigators something they had not possessed after the earlier deaths in Nanny Doss's life. A concrete reason to believe that a crime had occurred. Samuel had become seriously ill, been hospitalized, returned home, and then died. His doctor had questioned the circumstances and requested an autopsy. The examination revealed a large amount of arsenic. Nanny was then questioned about her husband's death, and eventually she admitted that she had poisoned him. But the confession did not end the investigation. Instead, it opened a much larger and darker chapter. Once Nanny began talking about Samuel, investigators learned that his death was not the only one she was prepared to discuss. The woman who had appeared to have suffered repeated family tragedies began describing a series of deaths that reached back approximately 27 years. The first challenge for investigators was to understand what Nanny was actually admitting. Her statements implicated her in the deaths of people who had occupied very different places in her life. Some were husbands, some were relatives, some were children. Some of the deaths had happened decades before Samuel died. The names formed a list that was extraordinary in its scope: Frank Harrelson, Arlie Lanning, Richard Morton, Samuel Doss, Louisa Hazel, a sibling, 2 children, 2 grandchildren, and the mother of Arlie Lanning. Altogether, 11 deaths were associated with Nanny through her confessions or the later reconstruction of her history. But the investigation could not simply treat every name on the list as a proven murder victim. The further investigators traveled into the past, the more difficult the evidence became. Samuel's body had been examined after his death. Arsenic had been discovered in large quantities. Nanny confessed to poisoning him. The other deaths were different. Some had occurred years earlier. Others had taken place in circumstances where illness, age, alcoholism, or apparent accidental poisoning could provide explanations that were not immediately criminal. Investigators had to separate what Nanny said from what could be independently established. This distinction is essential because the number 11 would later become one of the most repeated facts associated with Nanny Doss. While the legal record was much narrower, she would ultimately be prosecuted and convicted for only one murder, Samuel Doss. The other deaths remained part of the story surrounding her, but they did not become separate murder convictions. During questioning, however, Nanny's admissions gave investigators a reason to examine the earlier deaths in a new way. Frank Harrelson, her second husband, had died in 1945 after approximately 16 years of marriage. His problems with alcohol and the troubled nature of the relationship could have made his death appear less extraordinary. Yet Nanny later admitted that she had poisoned him. Arlie Lanning, her third husband, had died in 1950. He was described as an alcoholic and as a man who had relationships outside his marriage. Again, the circumstances could have allowed his death to remain an isolated tragedy. But Nanny later said she had killed him using rat poison. Richard Morton, her fourth husband, died in 1953 after only about 3 months of marriage. Nanny later confessed to poisoning him, describing arsenic in his coffee. Her mother, Louisa Hazel, had moved in with her in 1953 and died not long afterward. Nanny later admitted poisoning her as well. Then there were the deaths that went back even further. 2 of Nanny's daughters had died in 1927 under circumstances believed to involve food poisoning. Those deaths had occurred when Nanny was still a young mother. They had not produced a systematic murder investigation. Later, those deaths would become part of the list attributed to her. Other family deaths were also included, including a sibling, 2 grandchildren, and the mother of Arlie Lanning. The growing list made the case extraordinary, but it also made the work of investigators more complicated. A confession can be powerful evidence, but a confession about events that happened many years earlier raises practical questions. Where was the physical evidence? What medical records remained? Could the cause of death be reconstructed? Were there witnesses who could corroborate the circumstances? Could the original death certificate support or contradict Nanny's account? The information available in the case data does not provide a complete forensic reconstruction of each alleged killing. That limitation matters. It means that the 11 deaths should not be presented as 11 equally established murder cases. Instead, they belong to a broader history in which Nanny herself admitted responsibility for multiple deaths, while only one resulted in a criminal conviction. As investigators examined Nanny's history, they also considered possible motives. Financial gain was one factor associated with some of the deaths. Life insurance was relevant to the broader investigation, suggesting that money could have played a role, but the available evidence does not support reducing every killing to an insurance scheme. Nanny's relationships were complicated, and her lifelong fascination with romantic stories and the idealized image of marriage was another important element of her biography. She had repeatedly sought companionship, yet several of her marriages became troubled. Frank Harrelson struggled with alcohol. Arlie Lanning was described as an alcoholic and had extramarital relationships. Samuel Doss had conservative views and disliked Nanny's romantic novels. These circumstances provide context, but they cannot establish a single psychological explanation for the killings. One of the most striking features of Nanny's confession was the contrast between the apparent normality of the settings and the scale of the alleged violence. The victims were not strangers encountered by chance. They were people inside Nanny's own circle. A husband could die after years of marriage. A mother could move into her daughter's home and later die. Children could become victims within the family. The alleged pattern operated through relationships rather than through random encounters. That meant there was often an explanation available on the surface. A sick person had died. An alcoholic had died. A marriage had ended with the husband's death. A child had become ill. A relative had passed away. The absence of an obvious external threat could make suspicion less likely. The discovery of arsenic in Samuel's body changed that. It created the first strong reason to ask whether the apparent tragedies surrounding Nanny were actually connected. Her own admissions then supplied a narrative linking many of them. But there was another element of the investigation that affected how the public viewed her: her behavior while discussing the killings. Nanny reportedly laughed or giggled during parts of the questioning and while recounting the deaths. That reaction contributed to the nickname, the Giggling Granny. The label became memorable because it contrasted sharply with the seriousness of what she was describing. The public could easily focus on the unusual behavior, but the victims remained the central reality. Behind every name was a person who had died, often within a relationship of trust. The nickname could turn Nanny into a sensational figure. But the underlying case was about the people who never had the opportunity to tell their own stories. As the investigation developed, the legal strategy became clearer. Prosecutors did not attempt to bring 11 separate murder charges based solely on the growing list of deaths. Instead, they focused on the death for which the evidence was strongest. Samuel Doss had died in Oklahoma. His body contained arsenic. His death had been questioned by his doctor, and Nanny had confessed to poisoning him. This combination gave prosecutors a concrete case that could be presented in court. The earlier deaths could remain part of the investigation and public record, but they did not carry the same evidentiary foundation. That distinction also explains why the story of Nanny Doss can be misunderstood. Saying that she was responsible for 11 deaths is not the same as saying that a court convicted her of 11 murders. The number 11 belongs to the broader account of her confessions and the deaths attributed to her. The conviction belongs to Samuel Doss. This difference between historical accusation and legal proof is one of the most important lessons in the case. By the time prosecutors prepared to move forward, the investigation had already uncovered a remarkable history. For nearly 3 decades, Nanny had lived through marriages and deaths that, taken separately, might have seemed unrelated. Then Samuel died, and a doctor insisted on an autopsy. The arsenic discovery exposed the first clear evidence of deliberate poisoning. Nanny's confession connected her to Samuel's death and opened the door to other admissions. The investigators now had a story that reached from the late 1920s to 1954. But the courtroom would not be asked to judge every chapter of that story. It would focus on one man and one death. Samuel Doss was the case that could be proved. The other deaths would remain in the shadows of Nanny's confession. The next stage would therefore be less about discovering victims and more about determining what the legal system could establish. In 1955, Nanny would face the consequences of the death that had finally exposed her. The woman who had once appeared to be an ordinary widow would enter court with a history that had shocked investigators. Yet the verdict would concern only one murder. That was the paradox at the center of the case. 11 deaths could surround her name, but only one would become a formal conviction. By the time the investigation reached its final stage, the story surrounding Nanny Doss had become much larger than the death that had brought police to her door. Investigators had uncovered a history stretching from the late 1920s to 1954, a period of approximately 27 years in which people close to Nanny had repeatedly died. 2 children had died in 1927. Frank Harrelson died in 1945. Arlie Lanning died in 1950. Nanny's mother, Louisa Hazel, died in 1953. Richard Morton died only months after marrying Nanny that same year. Then came Samuel Doss in October 1954. Other relatives, including a sibling, 2 grandchildren, and the mother of Arlie Lanning, were also included in the list of deaths that Nanny later confessed to causing. The number associated with her name reached 11. But when prosecutors considered what could actually be taken into court, the situation was much narrower. They had to distinguish between a history of confessions and a murder that could be proven through evidence. Samuel Doss was the clearest case. His death had occurred only recently. A doctor had questioned the circumstances. An autopsy had been performed, and the examination had revealed a large amount of arsenic in his body. Those facts provided the foundation of the prosecution. Samuel's final illness was no longer simply a medical tragedy. The arsenic demonstrated that poison had been present in his body, and Nanny had admitted that she had administered it. The case against her therefore rested on a combination of medical evidence and her own confession. The earlier deaths were far more difficult to establish. Some had occurred years before, and some decades before. The further investigators moved into Nanny's past, the less physical evidence was available. The deaths of her 2 daughters in 1927 were particularly distant from the investigation. They had originally been regarded as cases involving food poisoning, not as established murders. Frank Harrelson had died in 1945, approximately 16 years after his marriage to Nanny. Arlie Lanning died in 1950. Richard Morton died in 1953 after only about 3 months of marriage. Louisa Hazel died after moving in with Nanny. Nanny later admitted to poisoning several of these people, but a later confession was not the same as having a complete forensic record from the time of death. That difference shaped the prosecution. The state did not need to prove every death associated with Nanny to secure a conviction for Samuel's murder. It needed to establish that Samuel had been deliberately poisoned and that Nanny was responsible. The evidence available for Samuel gave prosecutors a much stronger foundation than the older cases. Samuel had become ill in September 1954 and had been hospitalized. He was treated and discharged, but his condition deteriorated again after he returned home. He died on October 12th. The doctor who had treated him was not satisfied that the death had been natural. That decision to request an autopsy was the crucial investigative step. Without it, Samuel's death might have remained another unexplained illness. Instead, the examination exposed arsenic in his body and forced investigators to consider poisoning. The medical discovery also changed how they viewed Nanny herself. She was not merely the widow left behind by another family tragedy. She was now the spouse of a man whose body contained a large quantity of poison. When questioned, she admitted that she had killed him. Her confession removed one of the central obstacles investigators might otherwise have faced. There was no need to rely entirely on circumstantial suspicion about her relationship with Samuel. She had acknowledged responsibility. Yet the broader investigation remained important because it revealed the extraordinary history behind that single murder. The more Nanny spoke, the more deaths emerged. Her second husband, Frank Harrelson, became part of the investigation through her admission that she had poisoned him. Her third husband, Arlie Lanning, became another name after Nanny said she had killed him using rat poison. Richard Morton, her fourth husband, was also included after Nanny confessed to poisoning him with arsenic in coffee. Her mother, Louisa Hazel, was another person Nanny said she had poisoned. The deaths of her children and other relatives were also associated with her confessions. To investigators, the sheer number of admissions was extraordinary. But the law required more than an extraordinary story. It required a provable crime. This is why the distinction between 11 deaths and 1 conviction must remain at the center of any account of Nanny Doss. The public could hear about 11 victims. Newspapers could describe a woman surrounded by dead husbands and relatives. But the court was concerned with the evidence relating to Samuel. The other deaths did not automatically become convictions simply because Nanny had spoken about them. They remained part of the broader historical record of the case. Nanny's behavior also influenced the way the public interpreted the investigation. During questioning and while discussing the deaths, she reportedly giggled or laughed at times. The reaction was so striking that newspapers gave her the nickname the Giggling Granny. The name became one of the most recognizable labels attached to her. She was also described as the Lonely Hearts Killer and the Black Widow. These names reflected public fascination with a woman whose appearance did not fit the image many people expected of a murderer. Yet those labels risked turning the case into a story about the killer's personality rather than the victims. The central reality remained that people close to Nanny had died, and in several cases she later admitted responsibility for those deaths. The circumstances surrounding those people were different. Some relationships were troubled. Frank Harrelson had problems with alcohol. Arlie Lanning was described as an alcoholic and had extramarital relationships. Samuel had conservative views and disliked Nanny's romantic novels. Nanny herself had a long-standing fascination with romantic stories and the ideal of marriage. Some deaths also had a possible financial dimension, including issues involving life insurance. But none of these factors, taken alone, provides a complete explanation for what happened. The available evidence does not establish a single motive that accounts for every death. The case therefore remained disturbing partly because the motivation appeared more complicated than a simple desire for money. Nanny had repeatedly sought relationships, yet relationships repeatedly ended in death. The people closest to her became the people investigators later associated with the killings. When prosecutors prepared the case against her, they therefore had to avoid relying on the sensational scale of the broader story alone. 11 deaths could create suspicion, but suspicion was not enough. The strongest evidence remained tied to Samuel. His autopsy provided the physical evidence. His poisoning established the crime. Nanny's confession connected her to it. The other deaths could demonstrate the extraordinary context surrounding the defendant, but they could not substitute for proof in the Samuel case. In 1955, Nanny Doss appeared in court in connection with Samuel's death. Rather than contesting the charge through a prolonged trial, she pleaded guilty to killing him. On May 17, 1955, she admitted guilt to the murder of Samuel Doss. The legal process then produced a result that was considerably narrower than the public story surrounding her. Nanny received a sentence of life imprisonment. She was not sentenced to death, and she was not convicted of 11 murders. The legal record, therefore, contained 1 murder conviction, despite the extraordinary number of deaths associated with her confessions. The outcome illustrated the difference between the courtroom and the historical investigation. In the courtroom, the state had proved 1 death. Beyond the courtroom, Investigators and the public were left with a much larger and more disturbing account. Nanny had admitted responsibility for numerous deaths, but those admissions did not transform every historical death into a separate conviction. The case was therefore both resolved and unresolved at the same time. Samuel's murder had a legal conclusion. Nanny was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. But the broader question of exactly how many people she had killed remained dependent largely on her confessions and the reconstruction of events from years earlier. That uncertainty would follow the case for the rest of her life. The woman who had entered the investigation because of one poisoned husband had now been legally defined by one murder conviction, yet her name had become attached to 11 deaths. The difference between those two numbers would become one of the most important facts in the legacy of Nanny Doss. She had not been convicted as an 11-time murderer. She had been convicted of killing Samuel Doss. Everything else belonged to the darker history revealed after his death. And while the court had reached its decision, the story of Nanny Doss was not quite over. She would spend the remaining years of her life in prison, carrying with her the knowledge that the investigation into Samuel had exposed a past that might otherwise have remained hidden. By 1955, the investigation into Nanny Doss had reached a point where the distinction between suspicion, confession, and legal proof could no longer be ignored. Investigators had uncovered a history involving deaths that stretched back to the late 1920s, and Nanny had admitted responsibility for numerous people who had died around her. The number associated with her name had reached 11. Yet the courtroom would not determine whether all 11 deaths were murders. The prosecution centered on one victim, Samuel Doss. His death provided the clearest evidence and the strongest legal foundation. Samuel had become seriously ill in September 1954, had been hospitalized, had returned home, and then had deteriorated again. He died on October 12th. His doctor had questioned whether the death was natural and requested an autopsy. The examination revealed a large amount of arsenic in Samuel's body. Investigators questioned Nanny, and she eventually confessed to poisoning him. Those facts created a direct connection between the suspected poison and the defendant. The broader history remained disturbing, but Samuel's death was the case that could be taken into court. On May 17, 1955, Nanny Doss pleaded guilty to the murder of Samuel Doss. The decision brought the legal proceedings to a conclusion without requiring a lengthy courtroom battle over every death attributed to her. She was sentenced to life imprisonment. The sentence was significant for another reason. Nanny did not receive a separate conviction for the other deaths she had confessed to. The law treated Samuel's murder as the offense that had been established sufficiently for prosecution. The remaining deaths remained part of the larger story of her confessions and the investigation, but they did not become additional murder convictions. That distinction is essential when considering Nanny's legacy. The phrase 11 victims became closely associated with her, but the official criminal judgment concerned one murder. The difference between those two facts illustrates how a historical account can be broader than a legal record. Investigators could hear Nanny's admissions and recognize a disturbing pattern, but the courtroom required evidence that met the legal standard for conviction. Samuel's case had that foundation. His body contained arsenic. A doctor had questioned the circumstances of his death. Nanny had confessed. The earlier cases were not all supported by the same kind of evidence. Some deaths had occurred years before. Some had occurred decades earlier. In several cases, the physical evidence available at the time of the investigation was limited. The deaths of Nanny's two daughters in 1927, for example, belonged to a period when she was still a young mother. Those children had died under circumstances believed to involve food poisoning, but their deaths did not result in murder charges. Later, Nanny would be associated with them as part of her confession history. The same problem existed with the deaths of Frank Harrelson, Arlie Lanning, Richard Morton, Louisa Hazel, and the other relatives whose names appeared in the broader account. Their deaths could be described in connection with Nanny's later admissions. But they were not transformed into courtroom convictions simply because Nanny said she had caused them. The sentence therefore closed one part of the story while leaving another part unresolved. Nanny had been convicted. She would spend the remainder of her life in prison. But the larger question remained: how many people had actually died because of her actions? The most commonly cited answer was 11. Yet that number depended heavily on Nanny's own statements and on investigators' efforts to connect those statements to deaths from the past. The passage of time made certainty difficult. A person who confesses to a crime can provide information that investigators could never otherwise recover. But a confession about an event from many years earlier is not the same as a modern forensic reconstruction supported by physical evidence. This uncertainty is particularly important in a case like Nanny's because the distance between the earliest alleged deaths and her eventual arrest was enormous. Nearly 27 years separated the earliest deaths associated with her from the investigation that finally exposed the pattern. During that time, records could disappear, witnesses could forget, and the physical circumstances surrounding a death could no longer be examined. The legal system therefore dealt with the evidence that remained. Nanny's life in prison was far removed from the domestic world in which the alleged killings had occurred. The woman who had spent decades moving between marriages and family relationships was now confined by a life sentence. The freedom she had once possessed was gone. The series of relationships that had defined much of her adult life had ended. There would be no new husband, no new household, and no new opportunity for another death to be attributed to her. Her story had finally stopped moving outward. The investigation had reached its end, and the court had imposed its sentence. Yet the public fascination with Nanny did not disappear. Her unusual behavior during questioning had already helped create the image that newspapers remembered. She had reportedly giggled while discussing the deaths, contributing to the nickname the Giggling Granny. She was also described as the Lonely Hearts Killer and the Black Widow. Those labels turned her into a recognizable figure in the history of American crime. But the labels also created a risk. They could make the case seem like a strange story about a woman with an unsettling personality. Rather than a series of human losses, the people who died were not simply names in a list. They were children, parents, spouses, and relatives. They had lives and relationships that ended in circumstances that investigators later associated with Nanny. Their deaths affected families and left questions that could not always be answered. The most important lesson of the case is therefore not the nickname attached to Nanny or the number of husbands she married. It is the way repeated deaths can remain invisible when each event is viewed separately. One child dies, and the death may be considered an illness or accidental poisoning. Years later, a husband dies after struggling with alcohol. Another husband dies in another household. A mother moves in with her daughter and later dies. Another husband dies only months after marriage. If each event is examined alone, the pattern may never become visible. But when investigators finally had a reason to look backward, those separate events could be placed beside one another. Samuel's death was the key that unlocked that history. The doctor who requested an autopsy did more than identify poison in one man's body. That decision created the opportunity to question the entire history surrounding his wife. Without that examination, the story might have ended with Samuel's death being attributed to illness. The earlier deaths might have remained separate tragedies. The significance of the medical finding was therefore not only that it established arsenic poisoning, it changed the direction of the investigation. Nanny was questioned. She confessed to Samuel's murder. Then she began discussing other deaths. The investigation expanded backward in time. The past became evidence. But even after the investigation ended, important uncertainties remained. There was no courtroom judgment establishing 11 murders. There was one conviction. The remaining deaths existed in a complicated space between confession and proof. That does not make them irrelevant. It means they must be described accurately. Nanny's own admissions are central to understanding why investigators believed she was responsible for multiple deaths. At the same time, the legal record does not support presenting every alleged killing as equally proven. That distinction protects the integrity of the story and respects the difference between what was suspected, what was confessed, and what was established in court. Nanny spent the following years in prison. Her sentence was life imprisonment, and she would never return to the life she had once known. In 1965, approximately a decade after her conviction, Nanny was diagnosed with leukemia. She died on June 2, 1965, while still in custody in Oklahoma. She was 59 years old. Her death ended the life of the woman whose name had become associated with one of the most unusual family murder cases in American history. But it did not answer every question. Nanny died without being separately tried for the other deaths she had confessed to. The legal system had reached its conclusion with one conviction, while the broader historical mystery remained partly dependent on her own account. That is where the story of Nanny Doss ultimately leaves us. A doctor questioned a husband's death. An autopsy revealed arsenic. A wife confessed. Investigators looked backward and found a history of deaths stretching across decades. 11 people were ultimately associated with Nanny's confessions and the investigation. Yet only Samuel Doss became the subject of a murder conviction. The difference is more than a legal technicality. It is the line between a story that investigators reconstructed and a crime that prosecutors proved. Nanny Doss died in prison in 1965, but the questions surrounding her name remained. How many deaths were truly part of the pattern, and how many could never be proven beyond her own words? The answer most often given is 11. The answer the court established was 1. Between those two numbers lies the enduring mystery of the woman remembered as the giggling Granny. The legal case against Nanny Doss ended with a single conviction, but the investigation had uncovered a story that could not be contained within one courtroom verdict. On May 17, 1955, Nanny pleaded guilty to the murder of her fifth husband, Samuel Doss, and received a sentence of life imprisonment. That was the formal conclusion of the case. Yet the broader history revealed during the investigation remained far more complicated. Nanny had admitted responsibility for numerous deaths, and the number most often associated with her name was 11. Those deaths stretched across approximately 27 years, from the late 1920s through 1954. They included 4 husbands, her mother, a sibling, 2 children, 2 grandchildren, and the mother of Arlie Lanning. But the legal record established only one murder conviction. That distinction became the central unresolved issue of the case. How much of Nanny's confession could be independently proven, and how many of the deaths attributed to her could ever be established with certainty? The earliest deaths associated with Nanny were those of 2 of her daughters in 1927. Nanny and her first husband, Charlie Braggs, had 4 children. 2 of their daughters died when they were still young, under circumstances believed to involve food poisoning. At the time, there was no systematic murder investigation linking the deaths to their mother. Charlie eventually became suspicious of Nanny and left the marriage, taking their surviving daughter with him. Decades later, after Nanny's arrest, the children's deaths became part of the history she was said to have confessed to. But the distance between 1927 and the 1954 investigation created an unavoidable problem. The deaths had happened long before anyone was looking for evidence of deliberate poisoning. Whatever medical or physical evidence might once have existed was no longer part of a contemporary murder investigation. The same problem affected the death of Frank Harrelson in 1945. Frank had been Nanny's second husband, and their marriage had lasted approximately 16 years. He struggled with alcohol, and the relationship was troubled. When he died, his death did not result in Nanny's arrest. There was no established connection between his death and the earlier deaths in her family. Only years later, during the investigation into Samuel's death, did Nanny admit that she had poisoned Frank. That confession gave investigators a reason to reconsider the 1945 death. But it did not create the kind of contemporary forensic case that existed for Samuel. Arlie Lanning was another example. Nanny married him after her divorce from Charlie Braggs, and Lanning was described as an alcoholic who also had extramarital relationships. He died in 1950. At the time, his death did not immediately expose Nanny as a murderer. Later, Nanny told investigators that she had killed him using rat poison. The circumstances surrounding the Lanning household were also complicated by a fire after his death, when his mother was still in the house. Those details became part of the history associated with the case, but they did not result in a separate murder conviction. Once again, the investigation was forced to rely heavily on information that emerged after the fact. Nanny's mother, Louisa Hazel, was another victim in the broader account. In 1953, Louisa moved in with Nanny. Not long afterward, she died. Nanny later admitted that she had poisoned her mother. The death was significant because it expanded the alleged pattern beyond marriage. Nanny's victims, according to her own account, were not limited to husbands with whom she had troubled relationships. A member of her immediate family had also become a victim. That fact made the emerging history even more difficult to understand as a series of unrelated marital tragedies. Richard Morton followed in 1953. Nanny married him, but the marriage lasted only about 3 months before Morton died. Nanny later confessed that she had poisoned him with arsenic in coffee. Again, there was no separate conviction. The death became another piece of the larger pattern revealed after Samuel's poisoning was discovered. In retrospect, the sequence was striking. One husband died, then another and another. Yet the deaths were separated by years, and there was no investigation connecting them at the time. The pattern existed, but it remained invisible because nobody had assembled the pieces. Samuel's death changed that. His doctor questioned the circumstances, and the autopsy revealed a large amount of arsenic. That medical finding provided something the earlier deaths lacked: a clear indication of deliberate poisoning discovered close enough to the death for investigators to act on it. It also gave police a reason to examine Nanny's history. Once she confessed to killing Samuel, the investigators had a reason to ask whether other deaths might have occurred under similar circumstances. The answers produced the list of 11. Yet the very process that made the list possible also created its greatest uncertainty. Much of the information came from Nanny herself. Her statements were important, but they could not automatically establish every detail of every death. A confession can reveal events that investigators might otherwise never know about, but it still has to be evaluated within the evidence available. The case therefore exists on 2 levels. On one level is the story Nanny told, a woman admitting responsibility for multiple deaths among her family and husbands. On the other is the legal record, one murder conviction for Samuel Doss. The two are connected, but they are not identical. The uncertainty surrounding the other deaths also means that the exact number of victims remains difficult to establish with the same certainty as Samuel's murder. 11 is the commonly cited figure because it represents the deaths Nanny was believed to have confessed to causing. But the case does not provide 11 separate courtroom judgments. That distinction should not be overlooked simply because the number is memorable. The story is compelling precisely because it demonstrates how historical narratives can become more expansive than legal conclusions. The public remembered Nanny as a serial killer. The court convicted her of 1 murder. Both statements can be true, but they describe different levels of certainty. Her public image was also shaped by the way she behaved during the investigation. Nanny reportedly giggled while discussing some of the killings. That behavior led newspapers to call her the Giggling Granny. Other labels included Lonely Hearts Killer and Black Widow. These names emphasize the strange contrast between the appearance of an ordinary woman and the deaths associated with her. But focusing too heavily on those labels can obscure the victims. The people involved were not anonymous strangers. They were children, spouses, a mother, and other relatives. Their deaths occurred within family relationships, where trust and familiarity could make suspicion more difficult. The alleged pattern was therefore hidden in the very environment where people often assume they are safest. Nanny's lifelong fascination with romantic stories adds another complicated element. She had been drawn to stories of love and marriage from an early age, and she repeatedly entered relationships seeking companionship. Yet several of those relationships ended with the death of the husband. Financial issues, including life insurance, were relevant to some of the deaths, but the available account does not establish that money was the sole motive. The marriages also involved conflict and dissatisfaction. Some husbands had problems with alcohol. Samuel disliked Nanny's romantic novels. These circumstances provide context, but they do not explain the killings in a simple or definitive way. The lack of a single clear motive is part of what makes the case so difficult to interpret. Nanny Doss died in 1965 after being diagnosed with leukemia. She was 59 years old and remained in custody at the time of her death. She never faced separate trials for the other deaths associated with her confessions. As a result, some of the most important questions surrounding her history died with her. There was no later courtroom examination of every alleged victim. No comprehensive legal verdict established that all 11 deaths were murders committed by Nanny. The investigation had uncovered a disturbing pattern, but the pattern could not be reconstructed with equal certainty in every case. That unresolved quality remains central to the case today. The most secure facts are the ones that brought Nanny to justice. Samuel Doss died on October 12, 1954. His doctor questioned the natural explanation for the death. An autopsy found a large amount of arsenic in his body. Nanny confessed to poisoning him, and in 1955 she pleaded guilty and received a life sentence. Around those facts stands a much larger history of deaths attributed to her. The names are remembered, the confessions are part of the historical record, and the number 11 has become inseparable from her reputation. But the absence of separate convictions means that the story must always be told with care. The victims deserve accuracy more than sensationalism. Their deaths should not be treated simply as chapters in the legend of the woman who survived them. They were individual human tragedies that became connected only after Samuel's death forced investigators to look backward. That is perhaps the most disturbing lesson of Nanny Doss's story. A pattern can exist for years without being recognized as a pattern. Each death can be explained separately. Each tragedy can appear to have its own cause. Only when one event finally produces a question that cannot be dismissed does the larger picture emerge. For Nanny, that question came from a doctor who refused to accept Samuel Doss's death as natural. The autopsy revealed arsenic, and that discovery opened a history stretching back decades. It did not answer every question. It did not produce 11 convictions. But it transformed the way investigators understood the woman standing before them. Nanny Doss had entered the investigation as the widow of a sick husband. She emerged from it as a convicted murderer whose own confessions linked her to a far larger history of death. She spent the rest of her life in prison, and when she died in 1965, the legal case was long over. What remained was the unresolved gap between what Nanny said she had done and what the justice system was able to prove. 11 names remained attached to her story. Only one became a murder conviction. Between those two facts lies the enduring mystery of the giggling granny, a case in which the most frightening discovery was not a single murder, but the possibility that years of separate family tragedies had been part of one hidden pattern. By the time Nanny Doss died in 1965, the investigation that had begun with the death of Samuel Doss had already become part of American criminal history. Nanny had been sentenced to life imprisonment in 1955 after pleading guilty to Samuel's murder. She remained in custody for the rest of her life, and approximately a decade after her conviction, she was diagnosed with leukemia. On June 2, 1965, she died in Oklahoma at the age of 59. Her death ended the possibility of further questioning, further investigation, or separate trials concerning the other deaths she had admitted to. It also left behind a case whose central contradiction has never disappeared. Nanny Doss became known as a woman connected to 11 deaths, but the courts convicted her of only one murder. That difference is not a minor technical detail. It is the foundation for understanding what is known, what was confessed, and what could actually be proven. The story of Nanny Doss is often remembered through its most sensational elements. The multiple husbands, the poison, the family deaths, the strange laughter reported during questioning, and the nickname, the Giggling Granny. But beneath those details is a more complicated story about how a pattern can remain hidden when every death is viewed separately. For years, people around Nanny experienced individual tragedies rather than one recognizable series of crimes. Her first family had already suffered the deaths of 2 daughters in 1927. Her first husband, Charlie Braggs, survived the marriage, eventually leaving Nanny and taking their surviving daughter with him. Years later, Frank Harrelson died in 1945. Arlie Lanning died in 1950. Nanny's mother, Louisa Hazel, died in 1953. Richard Morton died after a marriage that lasted only about 3 months. Finally, Samuel Doss died in 1954. Looking at the timeline today, the sequence is disturbing, but the investigators who eventually examined it did not have the advantage of hindsight. They had to begin with one death and ask whether that death was criminal. Samuel's death provided that opportunity. His doctor questioned whether the illness that preceded his death had a natural explanation. The autopsy found a large amount of arsenic in his body. That finding transformed the case. Without it, the earlier deaths might never have been reconsidered as part of a possible pattern. With it, investigators had a reason to examine Nanny's history. Her confession then connected Samuel's poisoning to a much broader account of family deaths. This is perhaps the most important investigative lesson contained in the case. The discovery did not begin with a grand theory about a serial killer. It began with a medical professional refusing to accept an explanation that did not make sense. A single decision to request an autopsy created the evidence that allowed everything else to unfold. The investigation then moved backward through time. Nanny admitted that she had poisoned Samuel. She also admitted responsibility for other deaths. Frank Harrelson, Arlie Lanning, Richard Morton, Louisa Hazel, a sibling, 2 children, 2 grandchildren, and the mother of Arlie Lanning were included in the broader list. The total reached 11, but each additional name also raised a question of evidence. Samuel's death had a recent autopsy and a clear toxicological finding. The older deaths did not necessarily have comparable evidence available decades later. Some had originally been attributed to illness or poisoning without an established criminal explanation. Some had occurred so long before the investigation that a modern forensic reconstruction was impossible. The difference between those cases is essential because the temptation in a story like this is to turn every confession into an established fact. The historical record does not allow that level of certainty. Nanny's own admissions are an important part of the story, but they are not the same thing as 11 separate courtroom verdicts. The only murder for which she was prosecuted and convicted was the death of Samuel Doss. That legal conclusion should remain the clearest boundary around the case. The other deaths can be discussed as deaths Nanny confessed to causing or as deaths attributed to her through the investigation, but they should not be presented as if 11 murder convictions existed. There were not. This distinction also changes the way the case should be understood from the perspective of the victims. The number 11 can make the story sound like a statistic, but each person represented a separate human life. Some were children, some were spouses, one was Nanny's mother. Others were relatives connected to the family. They were people whose deaths were initially treated as individual events. Their names became connected only after investigators began looking backward. The danger of focusing exclusively on Nanny's nickname or personality is that it can turn those people into background figures in a story about the woman who survived them. Their death should instead remain at the center of the narrative. The case is disturbing not because Nanny possessed some theatrical image of evil, but because the alleged violence occurred inside relationships of familiarity and trust. The victims were people close enough to be part of her everyday life. The circumstances surrounding their deaths could therefore be mistaken for ordinary misfortune. A child could become sick. A husband could die unexpectedly. An elderly parent could pass away. A person with alcohol problems could suffer a fatal illness. When each event is considered individually, suspicion can fail to develop. Only the accumulation of deaths created the possibility of a pattern. The case also leaves difficult questions about motive. Nanny's lifelong fascination with romance and marriage was an important part of her biography. She read romantic stories and love columns and imagined an idealized form of love. Yet several of her marriages became troubled. Some husbands had problems with alcohol. Arlie Lanning was described as an alcoholic and had relationships outside the marriage. Samuel Doss held conservative views and disliked Nanny's romantic novels. Financial considerations, including life insurance, were relevant to some of the deaths. But none of these elements provides a complete explanation for the entire series. There is no single motive in the available account that can be used to explain every death with certainty. That uncertainty is important. It prevents the case from being reduced to a simple formula in which every action has one obvious cause. What can be stated more confidently is that Nanny repeatedly entered intimate relationships and that several people close to her later died. She eventually admitted responsibility for multiple deaths. The investigation into Samuel gave authorities the opportunity to examine that history, and the resulting picture was extraordinary. Her public image was shaped heavily by her reported behavior during questioning. She reportedly giggled while discussing the killings, and newspapers transformed that reaction into the nickname, the Giggling Granny. She was also called the Lonely Hearts Killer and the Black Widow. Those labels have endured because they capture the strange contrast between the appearance of an ordinary woman and the deaths associated with her. Yet the nicknames do not answer the most important questions. They do not explain why people died. They do not establish which deaths could be proven. And they do not restore the lives of the victims. They are descriptions created after the fact, shaped by the public's fascination with the case. The more meaningful legacy lies elsewhere. Nanny Doss's case demonstrates how difficult it can be to recognize repeated violence when it occurs within a family. It also demonstrates the importance of distinguishing between suspicion and proof. The investigation revealed 11 deaths associated with Nanny's confessions, but the court established one murder. That legal boundary should not weaken the significance of the investigation. Instead, it shows how the justice system must work with the evidence available rather than with the full weight of public suspicion. Samuel's murder was supported by a combination of medical evidence and confession. The other deaths remained in a different category. They were part of the disturbing history surrounding Nanny, but they did not receive the same legal resolution. In the years after her conviction, Nanny remained imprisoned. Her sentence prevented her from returning to the world in which the deaths had occurred. She lived under the consequences of the crime that had finally been proven. Then leukemia ended her life in 1965. With her death, investigators lost the opportunity to ask further questions about the other deaths. The uncertainty surrounding them became permanent. There would be no additional trials, no new confessions from Nanny, and no possibility of testing every admission against evidence that might have existed. What remained was the historical record. Nanny Doss's name became associated with 11 victims, but the most certain legal fact remained one murder conviction. That distinction is perhaps the final and most important lesson of the case. True crime can be drawn toward numbers, nicknames, and shocking revelations. But accuracy requires remembering the limits of what can actually be known. Nanny Doss was convicted of killing Samuel Doss. She confessed to killing others. Investigators connected those admissions to a history of 11 deaths. Beyond that point, certainty becomes more difficult. The story therefore ends not with a complete answer, but with a boundary between evidence and uncertainty. A doctor questioned one death. An autopsy revealed poison. A confession opened decades of hidden history. A court delivered one conviction. And when Nanny died in prison, the unanswered questions remained. Perhaps that is what makes the case endure. Not simply the number of deaths, nor the unsettling nickname attached to the woman at its center, but the realization that a long series of tragedies can remain invisible until someone finally asks whether they are connected. In Nanny Doss's case, that question came too late to produce answers for every victim. But it came early enough to establish the truth about Samuel Doss. And for the rest of the people whose deaths became part of Nanny's confession, the historical record would have to carry what the courtroom never could: their names, their connection to her, and the unresolved question of exactly what happened to them.